Lord, the light of your love is shining in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us. Set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me. Shine on me. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze. Set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow. Flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning and welcome to Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith. Thank you so much for joining me on the program today. We are going to continue and wrap up this short little series we've done talking about the life of Jacob. For the last few weeks now, we've been talking about the life of Jacob and going over these really powerful lessons about trust and about faith. Like I said, we're wrapping this up today. In week one, the first week we did this a few weeks ago, we were talking about trusting God when it made sense to, and we didn't really have any reason to distrust Him. The second week we talked about trusting God even when we were cheated by the people around us, betrayed. Last week we talked about trusting God when we were afraid. And this week we're going to be talking about trusting God when nothing makes sense. When your life is falling apart, when you're ready to give up, when you're standing on the precipice of hell, where God's presence is questionable, His actions are downright confusing. And if you've not been there yet, and you're not there now, there may very well be a day that you are, and maybe the things we go over today will be of some help to you in some way. Now, here's the way that we're going to go about this today. I've got 3 stories I want to share with you. One of them is a story that happened a long time ago. I'd like to share that with you. And then there are 2 stories I'd briefly like to share with you, things that happened really fairly recently. So let's start with the one that took place a long time ago. And this, of course, is going to be the end of the story of Jacob. Now, this is a story about Jacob in his later years. Now, as Genesis progresses, and we see the story of Abraham, then of Isaac, then of Jacob, Jacob becomes less the focal point, although I would argue that in some way the story is still really about him, but the attention shifts to his sons. And you might remember that with 4 different women, that's a whole other story, but with 4 different women, he has a total of 12 sons. And so the story is, a lot of it is focused on their actions and their activity. So that's what we're going to be talking today, and this is especially going to be regarding one of his sons named Joseph. So Joseph is one of 2 sons that he has with his wife Rachel, which you might remember, this is the wife that he originally, this is the only wife he really wanted. Back in the very beginning, he just wanted to marry Rachel. And so Joseph has a really special place in Jacob's heart. He's sort of the baby of the family too at this point, and so he's treated like the baby of the family. And as you can imagine, a lot of his brothers were a bit jealous of that favoritism that Jacob seemed to show towards him. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in Genesis chapter 37. There's going to be some of this that we're going to read. A lot of it we're going to have to summarize just because of the sheer scope of what we're covering here. But we're going to walk all the way from Genesis 37 all the way over to Genesis 50, going over the story in broad terms here. So if you want to follow along, you're welcome to. Like I said, we're going to do some reading, some summarizing. So at the very beginning of chapter 37, we see that favoritism come out. It said that Jacob really loved Joseph. He gives him this coat of many colors, and his brothers weren't too thrilled with that. So they were jealous of him. They were jealous of the attention that he got. And it's not as if Joseph really made things any better, because what Joseph did was he had a dream. And in this dream, symbolically through this dream, what he learned was that all of his brothers, at some point later in their lives, all of his brothers were going to bow down to him. And by the way, his mother and his father also would bow down to him. And just like any nice brother would do, he went and told all of his other brothers about this dream that he had of them bowing down to him one day. And, he's the youngest, right? So, of course, they mock him, they make fun of him. He's not the most popular kid on the block. At least not in this household. And so he earns the ire of all of his siblings. And so at some point, you have the brothers that are out shepherding the flock of Jacob. And Joseph had stayed behind and stayed with his father and mother. And he was eventually sent out to go and check on them. So as Joseph is coming, and remember, they're some distance off now from where Jacob and now Joseph's mother lived. They're away from home, and they see Joseph coming, and they have this thought that let's just take him out. Let's get rid of him. So they bully him quite a bit, throw him down into this hole in the ground, this pit, and they at first decide, yeah, we're going to kill him. We're going to take his life. They eventually think better of it when they see some Midianite traders passing by, and they decide, well, we might as well make a profit off of it, right? So they sell their brother into slavery. That's not great. So they sell their brother into slavery, but they've got to have some way to cover the whole thing up, because how are they going to explain to their father that Joseph didn't come back when he was supposed to go and check on them? So they take his coat of many colors that they had stripped off of him. They covered it in lamb's blood, which I'm sure there's a metaphor in there somewhere, right? They cover it in lamb's blood, and then they bring it to their father Jacob. And how do you think Jacob responds? He concludes, understandably, well, a wild animal must have taken his life, must have torn him to pieces. And look how he responds, here in chapter 37, verse 34. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Jacob, understandably upset at what he sees as the loss of his dearest son. But the story continues, because as we know, Jacob didn't at the time, but we know that Joseph was actually sold into slavery. And you have this, from Genesis 39 through 41, you get this really dramatic story about how Joseph ends up serving in the house of Potiphar, who's a prominent official in Egypt, and he ends up making quite a positive reputation for himself. He's a hard worker, he's honest, right? But then he ends up falsely accused of sexual misconduct by Potiphar's wife, and he ends up thrown into prison. In reality, Joseph didn't do anything, but he ends up in prison anyway. And in the wake of this, God gives Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. And he starts to make a bit of a reputation for doing this. And long story short, Pharaoh ends up having a dream that really troubles him. He calls all of his wise men together and all of his magicians and sorcerers and all the people in the court of Egypt together, and demands that they interpret his dream, which he's not going to tell them, but they've got to interpret it anyway. And of course, they can't do it. And so Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, and he says, well, I can't do it, but God can. God can do it through me. And so he offers them this interpretation. And the dream is actually really significant to the story, because the dream essentially symbolizes that there's this famine coming up. There's going to be 7 years of plenty where they're going to have a surplus of food, but they really need to be careful, because after that, there's going to be 7 years of famine, and it's going to devastate the region. So it's in Egypt's best interest to stockpile while they can, and then by the time that all this whole region is in famine, which it seems like this famine extends well beyond Egypt. We know it affects the land of Canaan where Jacob lives, but it's affecting this whole area. And what happens then is Egypt has stored food, right? So what they do now is they're now able to sell this food to all of their surrounding neighbors and get really, really wealthy in the process. So Joseph interprets this dream, and because of his successful interpretation, again, long story short, Joseph ends up pretty much being put in charge of Egypt. Technically, he ends up as second in command, only behind Pharaoh, but Pharaoh, it seems, had pretty much abdicated all of his responsibilities and said, Joseph, I want you to take care of all the hard work here. Okay, so Joseph is given this really, really prominent position in Egypt, and he ends up being the one who's in charge of distributing the food. Okay, so that's really important to the flow of the story. So now, in Genesis 42, we're going to pick up here. Genesis 42, remember, Jacob's house is affected by this famine. So this is what happens starting in verse 1. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, Why do you look at one another? And he said, Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother. Here's going to be something really important here. I don't know if Joseph even knew about Benjamin yet. But Benjamin's position now has essentially been sort of the replacement of Joseph. He's now the youngest brother, and that's going to play a really important role here soon. Okay, so they all go down to Egypt minus Benjamin. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Do you remember the dream? The dream that one day his brothers would bow themselves to the ground before Joseph? Now, this is a point in the story you've got to be thinking, is this all just really one big coincidence, or is something bigger going on here? Right? Is something bigger going on here? Is somebody at work? Now, here's what happens. Now, this is where I'm going to urge you to try to pay close attention. I'll try to explain this as well as I can. It's really pretty simple in broad terms, but it's kind of complicated the way it happens. So Joseph immediately recognizes these people. He immediately recognizes that these are his brothers, right? But his brothers have no idea who he is. And there could be a number of reasons for it. You know, they probably didn't expect to see him there, for one thing. Maybe he was dressed in very Egyptian attire that somehow masked his true identity. I don't know. We're not really told why they didn't recognize him, but they didn't recognize him. So Joseph knows who this is. They have no idea who he is. And he pretends to have, he doesn't know anything. He acts like these are a bunch of foreigners. In fact, he acts rather suspicious of them. And he starts asking them questions. Do you have a brother? And they tell him about Benjamin. And once he finds out about Benjamin, he suddenly becomes really protective. Because, what happened the last time with their youngest brother? Well, you're looking at him, right? He got sold into slavery and almost killed. So Joseph immediately feels this connection to Benjamin, and he decides to make a deal with him. He says, in order to prove that you're not spies, which he knows they're not spies, but it's all part of the game to protect Benjamin, right? Simeon is going to stay, one of their brothers. Simeon stays here as leverage, right? And you're going to go back and you're going to bring Benjamin to me. Meanwhile, he decides to go ahead and give them the grain that they came to buy. They initially take the money out of their sacks to give it to him, but then he, without their knowledge, he actually has his servants put the money back into their bags. All right, so what happens now is Simeon has stayed behind. The brothers go back to Jacob, and on their way they discover all the money is back in our sacks. Uh-oh. Because what does it look like now? Or what do they think it looks like? It looks like now that they've stolen the grain and they kept their money and somehow tricked this Egyptian official. But they promised to bring back Benjamin. And Simeon is still there. What are they going to do? Jacob is obviously in distress about all of this. In chapter 42, verse 36, look what he says. You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me. And then down in verse 38, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol. So he's in absolute despair. Now, Reuben and Judah, two of his sons, they decide to start negotiating. Reuben is reckless, and he decides, he says, if I don't come back with Benjamin, you can kill my own two sons, which that's too far, you know. Judah, he doesn't promise his son's safety, but or he doesn't leverage his son's safety against it, but he decides to promise and vouch for Benjamin, and the blame will be on him forever if anything happens to him. So they negotiate a little bit because they understand that they're in a desperate situation. They need the food. They need to go back to Egypt to buy more grain. And if they do it, they need to bring Benjamin with them to make sure that they convince this Egyptian official that they're not spies. So eventually Jacob agrees. But notice Jacob's attitude here. In chapter 43, verse 14, he says, as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. He's pretty much resigned himself, right? He's pretty much decided that this isn't going to work out. We see more of that distrust coming out in Jacob. The same thing that he struggled early on in his life with, that constant skepticism, that constant distrust. He's still wrestling with it. So the brothers go back. They take Benjamin with them. And Joseph meets Benjamin. And here's what happens from here. They buy more grain. He puts the money back in their sacks, once again without their knowledge. But then he decides, we're gonna frame Benjamin. They take some of the valuable objects around the court, some of the idols, some of the precious metals, and they put it into Benjamin's sack without his knowledge. So once the brothers start to go away, Joseph chases them down and he says, why have you stolen from me? Of course, he finds all the money. But then he talks about the idols and everything else that they stole. And obviously, they have no idea what he's talking about. They say, you know, if any of us have stolen anything like that from you, they'll be your slave forever. And sure enough, they find in Benjamin's pack all this stuff that Joseph's servants planted in his sack, right? And again, it was all a ruse and a ploy to get Benjamin back. And so his brothers start pleading for him. Judah, I think, is ready to trade places to him, you know, volunteering as tribute and all. It says, why have you done this to us? And finally, Joseph, he caves. Chapter 45, he tells them who he really is. He tells them, reveals to them, I'm your brother Joseph. And they just can't believe it. And frankly, you know, it is pretty unbelievable, isn't it? Jacob can't believe it either. In chapter 45, verse 26, look at this. Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. Imagine hearing that after everything that Jacob went through. And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them. Yeah, I mean, who would, right? And then in chapter 46, verse 29, finally, it says, he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. You have this reunification of Joseph with his father. And suddenly everything that Jacob was worried about, everything that he was grieved over, all of it was suddenly resolved. Really fascinating how this story ends too. In chapter 50, Jacob eventually dies, and his brothers start to be very concerned that now that with their father gone, maybe Joseph's going to take out a little of his anger on them now and mistreat them, or have his vengeance. So they come to him very apologetic for what they had done. And here's what Joseph says. And it's so fitting. It's really almost this conclusion to the whole life of Jacob. It certainly is for the life of Joseph, but I think it's really this conclusion and wrap up of the life of Jacob and maybe even the whole story of Genesis. So in chapter 50, verse 20, he says, as for you, You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. From Jacob's perspective, I imagine that there were a number of times when it didn't seem like God was present. It didn't seem like God was involved. It didn't seem like he cared. There were evil people in control. God had forgotten his promises. But in reality, God was at work the entire time. I want to tell you about Harrison and Haley Waldron. Harrison Waldron grew up in the country of Honduras, a child of a couple of Christian missionaries there. He eventually went to Harding University in Arkansas, where he met his wife on a study abroad program in Greece. They got married on May 31st, 2014, just over a year after they got married. On August 14th, 2015, they were attending a wedding of one of their friends. And Harrison was one of the groomsmen. And the groomsmen were outside, and they had this four-wheeler that they were taking turns going on, and was having a good time. And they had told Harrison, you should try it out. And Harrison was a little hesitant. He didn't feel super comfortable with it, but he decided to, let's go ahead and give it a shot. So he gets on the four-wheeler. Shortly after, one of the groomsmen comes running inside to where Haley was and tells her, "There's been an accident. You need to come out here right away." Haley recalls going outside from the wedding venue, and she just started running to where the accident was. And, she didn't know what to expect. She didn't know how severe it was or what exactly had happened. She recalls, as she ran, this feeling of thinking, quote, "I'm going to die." She gets to this place where there's a creek right in front of her, and the four-wheeler's down there. Harrison is also down there, face down, completely motionless. Shortly after, a helicopter comes over them and lands in the field adjacent, and Harrison is life-flighted to a nearby hospital. He was in a coma, and it didn't look like he was ever going to come out of it. It didn't look like he was going to make it but maybe a few days. So things didn't look great. He made it a few days, but he was still in a coma. And they said, well, I don't think he's ever going to come out of it. Well, he came out of the coma. Unfortunately, the damage that had been inflicted on his body was really, really severe. Harrison was largely incommunicative, although eventually they did discover that he could communicate with a tablet through this technology. Really neat. But he was able to eventually communicate, but he was largely immobile, mostly incommunicative. And Haley had been married to him for about a year. But she decided at that time that she was going to be right by his side. She had committed to be his wife in sickness and in health and do whatever she needed to take care of him. And that's exactly what she did. Obviously, she was totally in shock at first. But in the days and weeks and months and years to follow, she met this challenge with the most remarkable amount of faith. And she went around speaking at these places, talking about all that God had done for them. Can you believe that? All that God was doing for them right then. In 2017, in an interview she gave, she says, quote, "God has done great things in my life, and I know if he loves me and he loves Harrison, which I believe he does tremendously, we're going to be okay. He's going to give us meaning in our brokenness, and one day when we're all completely whole in heaven, it's going to be amazing." I don't know many people who are able to be in a situation like that and talk about all that God is doing for them. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, do you agree? Can God work through something like that? Some of you might know the name Botham Jean. Botham Shen John was born in St. Lucia, Southern Caribbean. He eventually attended Harding University, where he was an avid singer, often led whole university in chapel services, worship singing, and He got a degree in accounting and shortly thereafter moved to the city of Dallas, Texas. His name hit national headlines on September 6, 2018, when Amber Geiger, a police officer with the Dallas PD, goes into what she believed to be her residence. She opens the door, sees Botham standing there, thinks that somebody has broken in or something of the sort, takes out her firearm and shoots. Botham Jean died on the scene shortly thereafter. Obviously, in the wake of this, there was political outrage, calls of police brutality and racism and everything else that you can imagine, and such extreme hostility against Officer Geiger. A remarkable thing happened at her court trial. Botham's brother, Brett, gets up at one point and is able to speak, and she tells Officer Geiger something that he didn't need to, but he told her, "I forgive you. I forgive you." The Botham Jean Foundation was founded in the wake of this tragedy. Supports a number of different causes, including the St. Lucia Church of Christ, the Gross Islet Church of Christ there in St. Lucia, the Marian Home for the Elderly, the Gross Islet Infant School. Various community food drives have been conducted on behalf of the memory of Botham Jean, medical missions. His whole legacy of service is an inspiration to hundreds and thousands of people who want to follow in his footsteps. When situations in life arise that seem to conflict with God's goodness and his promises, there is this temptation to assume that God isn't working, to doubt his faithfulness, to doubt his presence. But just because God's activity isn't obvious in the immediate situation doesn't mean that God isn't active. Just because you question God's faithfulness or his presence doesn't make him any less present or any less faithful. It doesn't necessarily mean that God caused the mess to advance his will. I very much doubt that God forced his brothers to sell him into slavery, to sell Joseph into slavery. But God can work through the mess for his purposes. And maybe he's doing the same thing for you. Something to reflect on this week. Before we wrap up, I do want to tell you about some of the resources that we offer to our listeners. We have a 7-part Bible correspondence course published by the World Bible School. We also have Bibles, hardcover ESV translation, the same translation we use here on the show. You're welcome to any of these resources and materials. Just let us know that you'd like them. You can reach us by mail with the address there on the top. You can also find this information on our website at letthebiblespeak.net. We have a podcast. You can listen to these episodes on both Podbean and on Spotify. Just search Let the Bible Speak UP. We're also on YouTube in the same way. I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program today. May God bless you, and I hope you have a wonderful week.
Glory blaze, Spirit blaze, set our hearts on fire. Flow, river flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send